And in this section, we're going to talk about the association areas of the brain. So we'll talk about the premotor cortex. We mentioned this earlier, and how this was actually a region of your frontal lobe. It's considered an association area because this is actually going to help with planning of motor movements. But in order to plan something, you got to really understand, your environment around you. You got to understand the goal at hand, and taking all this information together and using past memories of that action can help you basically perform the correct action. And it's your premotor cortex that helps you to coordinate learned and skilled activities, right? So we're seeing a lot of this in the Olympics because there's people who have very learned and skilled activities and they're carrying these out. They would be using their premotor cortices to do this. Like not something you're born with. You have to train and learn how to do these things. And it's your premotor cortex that's involved with this kind of processing, right? So this differs from the somatosensory association area because this one's still in the parietal lobe, just posterior to the postcentral gyrus. But as an association area, it helps to bring lots of information together to form a more complete picture, right? And a good example I like to use is like, how do I know that this is a remote if my eyes are closed and I'm just feeling the remote, right? Well, if you think about it, like if your eyes are closed, you're just feeling it. Well, first of all, you got to use your somatosensory cortex because that's body sensation. Like you're using your skin to feel the remote, and so the skin sensations that are helping you touch that remote. Now, I can feel that it's hard, kind of plasticky, and it has a certain temperature to it, right? And then I can feel on the other side that there are rubber round structures that feel like buttons, right? Now, what I would then use is my somatosensory association area to basically understand then all that information, put it together to say that's a remote, right? Because I can't feel the whole thing at once. I got to take all that little pieces of information, put that all together to know that this is a remote. Now I'm using my somatosensory cortex to feel specific pieces, but over time, integrating lots of information together can tell me that this is a remote control. And so you're using your somatosensory association areas for more complex understanding. I think I hit something with this remote. Is that what's going on? There we go. Wait. Hold on.
That's the definition of insanity.
There we go. Well, I didn't realize that it was going. I thought it was flipping to the next screen. Yeah. You had a question?
I don't know if this is on the same subject, but like say if you're at, carnival, and
Sure.
then you have to close your eyes and you're eating 14 different things, and you're trying to figure out what it is. Sometimes it's hard to pinpoint what it is. Would that be the same area? Or
You're close. You're close. Now, let's say if you're eating something, you would use your somatosensory association area as that thing is in your hands, right? Or even in your mouth. But taste is not somatosensory sensation. Taste is something else. So then you would use more like your gustatory association area. That way you can understand like what exactly you're tasting. But you would mix that with somatosensory association area to understand the finer nuances of that food, like beyond the taste, what's the texture? Beyond the taste, what's the temperature, right? Or the consistency of that. So that would give you a better idea of what you're tasting. But you're right, like if your eyes are closed, it's pretty difficult to taste something, especially also if your nose is plugged. Because a lot of taste is actually smell. In fact, you would use other association areas too. Like you actually might use some of the auditory feedback from that food. Like if it's crunchy or if it's soft, it makes certain noises when you bite into it, right? Like I imagine like if you're eating like hot Cheetos, like they're going to sound a certain way versus maybe hot Cheetos with nacho cheese on top, right? I'm just thinking of like carnival food. Yeah. Wernicke's is only speech comprehension, so that's a little different. But this auditory association area would be used to help you understand more complex sounds, right? Not just tones, but entire words. And not just words, but entire sentences. And not even just communication, but also different sounds like, memory of music and other tones and just more complex associations here. That's your auditory association area, also found near the primary auditory cortex in your temporal lobe. Now, the visual association area is involved with complex visual processing, right? Not just seeing like a particular shape or a particular shade of a color, but also like taking all that information together and knowing I'm looking at a desk, right? Because you can see, okay, well, it has a particular shape here, and there's different angles. I can use my visual association area, match that with other memories I've already formed to understand exactly what I'm looking at, okay? Now, we have Wernicke's area as well. This one's involved with comprehending spoken and written language. If y'all remember, Wernicke's area spans the temporal and parietal lobes. This one's pretty important, though. In fact, if we get damage to Wernicke's area, we lose our ability to comprehend language. Not necessarily produce language, but comprehend it. So we could still say words, but we couldn't comprehend the words that we were saying because you couldn't hear your own voice, at least not understand what you're saying, even if you were producing real words.
That could be bad.
Yeah, it could be bad. So the Gnostic area, though, you guys, is actually really interesting. This is actually an association area or a common integrative area of all the other association areas. So if we talk about like the auditory, visual, gustatory, olfactory, and somatosensory association areas, the Gnostic area integrates all of this together. And this is what we think about as being more of like your conscious centers, because you're taking all the sensory information in that you're feeling right now, putting it together to feel your experience, whether that's the visual or auditory experience, but it's all interlinked. So that we call it the Gnostic area. So this is a lot of where consciousness would occur.
Where's it located?
Gnostic area is found just in the center of Wernicke's area, right at the juncture of the temporal and parietal lobes. Good question. So now, deeper in the brain, we find white matter. Now, you might wonder, okay, well, how do these association areas communicate if one's here and one's here? Well, axons, right? Because that's how neurons communicate. Now, the way they would communicate then is, let's say if you have your premotor cortex and you want it to communicate with, like, your Gnostic area, then the way that those would communicate is through white matter connections. We said that white matter was essentially myelinated axons. It's deeper to the cortex, and it's composed primarily of myelinated axons, and these actually form different types of tracts. So there's 3 types of tracts we have here: association, commissural, and projection. The association tracts actually connect to nearby brain regions. Projection go up and down, like superior inferiorly, and then commissural go across the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so let me just show you guys a picture here. So on this slide, what we see then are these different types of fibers. In blue, this is showing the commissural fibers. So commissural fibers connect one cerebral hemisphere to the next. Projection fibers connect superior and inferior brain regions. And then association fibers connect brain regions within the same cerebral hemisphere. So there's 2 types of association fibers, you guys. We got the arcuate ones, which connect just very adjacent brain regions, and the longitudinal, which connects, anterior and posterior brain regions. So let's say if we wanted our left premotor cortex to communicate with our left Gnostic area, because they're pretty far apart, but they're still within the same hemisphere, we would use these longitudinal association fibers to connect back and forth, right? Or if we wanted our premotor cortex to communicate with our primary motor cortex, because they're side by side, then you would use an arcuate form of association fibers because they're just connecting very nearby brain regions. Now, your brain is highly interconnected, and if I can give you guys any kind of perception of this, you got about 100 billion neurons in your brain, right? And a billion's 1,000 million. So what you're saying is you have 100,000 million neurons in your brain. That's a lot of neurons, right? And each one forms up to 1,000 different connections. So it's an astronomical number of connections here, you guys. So we're saying of your 100 billion neurons, each of those forms 1,000 different connections. That's a lot of, it's an extremely complex organ. If you look at it, it looks like mush. But if you actually study its structure microscopically, you find out that it's actually one of the most complex things we know of. So it's pretty amazing, but not surprising considering what we're capable of. Now, we're going to get away from the cerebrum and talk about the diencephalon. If y'all remember, the diencephalon was found deeper within the brain, and this would be like as if you pulled the mushroom cap off, it would be that very deep central region, deep within that mushroom, okay? Now, the diencephalon's got 3 different parts: hypothalamus, thalamus, epithalamus. You guys remember what this looked like in cross-section? The diencephalon looked like in cross-section? Little bird, exactly. So the bird beak was the hypothalamus, the eye and the surrounding face was the thalamus, and the back of the head was the epithalamus. So here's what it looks like. Here's our bird. So we have our thalamus here. And the eye of that thalamus is basically what we call the interthalamic adhesion, so it connects the right and left thalami together. This is the hypothalamus, which is kind of like the bird beak. And back here is the epithalamus. You guys can see it kind of looks like a bird's head. This is corpus callosum, which is not technically part of the diencephalon, but it's nearby. Remember, corpus callosum is a commissural fiber that connects the two cerebral hemispheres together. Oh, heck, guess what? We can see a little choroid plexus in here too. So what was the function of choroid plexus? Yeah, it produces CSF. Very good. And in fact, what was this space here between the two thalami? You guys remember? Lateral ventricles are deep within the cerebrum. So which one would this be?
Is that where it drops down?
Yeah, it drops down. Not yet. Third ventricle. Yeah. So the third ventricle is here. Actually, can you guys tell it's a little bit recessed? That's why there's a shadow here. It's a very thin space. But you see that this would be kind of a recess in the brain tissue? I mean like a depression, rather. That's filled with fluid, and that is the third ventricle. Okay? We're only looking at half of it, though. So if you put the two halves together, there's a narrow space there, and that's the third ventricle. Now, the diencephalon forms the wall of your third ventricle. So you have your thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and these have a variety of functions we'll talk about. So the epithalamus forms the posterior root of the diencephalon, also contributes to part of the third ventricle, but really the key point here, you guys, is we got the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is a part of the epithalamus that secretes a hormone called melatonin. And melatonin is involved with regulating your sleep-wake cycles, aka the circadian rhythm. So if you ever wondered, like, why do you feel sleepy at a certain time of the day? Or why do you feel like you're energized at other times of the day? That's in part regulated by the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin on a rhythmic kind of pattern. And that rhythm of the secretion of this hormone helps to coordinate your sleep-wake cycles, which is pretty awesome. So this plays a pretty important role in our day-to-day life. Now, what's interesting about the pineal gland, you guys, is that this is linked up with your visual system. So the pineal gland, which secretes a hormone that regulates your day-to-night rhythms, aka circadian rhythm, that's linked up with your eyes. And in fact, it actually gets visual input to know, or to at least process, when it is daylight and when it is dark. And that's how your brain can use that information to help coordinate, sleep-wake cycles, because it's getting visual information. So if it's really bright out, that information is sent to your pineal gland, and your pineal gland interprets that as daylight, right? But under what circumstances could you be exposed to bright light, even though if it's not day?
TV if your light's on.
Yeah, TV if your light's on, fluorescent lighting in these rooms, your phone right before bed, staring at your phone, looking at Instagram or whatever people do. I look at YouTube, so whatever. But that is light that's going to stimulate your eyes, and that could throw your pineal gland off. So what we're finding is actually an epidemic of sleep disturbance. Is people aren't sleeping enough because of the fact that we're using technology too late into the night, and that's simulating what it's like to be in daytime. So our brains have a hard time slowing down and shutting off. So people are staying up later, but we still have to wake up early because that's just how life is. So we're getting less sleep. So the average American gets several hours less sleep than they did like 30 years ago, which is amazing, right? Now, we're not totally clear about what types of diseases can result from a lack of sleep, but we might start to see new things pop up, you guys, because we're leading into uncharted territory here. But over the course of human history, people have slept through the night, right? But we're now reaching a period of time where people are getting far less sleep because of our technology. So, who knows what we'll see in the future. So it's interesting. But remember, that's the pineal gland. It secretes the hormone melatonin, which regulates your circadian rhythm or sleep-wake cycle. You can buy this stuff in the store, by the way. You can go to King Soopers right now and buy a big old jar of melatonin. People take this as a supplement to help them sleep. Now, your epithalamus also contains the habenular nuclei. Now, these habenular nuclei are involved in the visceral and emotional responses to odor. When you think of visceral, what comes to mind?
Organs.
Guts, internal organs, good. And then emotional responses to an odor. So what might be a visceral response to an odor? Yeah, like throwing up, exactly. Like smelling something really horrible and then throwing up. That's a visceral response, absolutely. Or smelling something wonderful and calming, and you kind of just, your heart rate slows down, your blood pressure decreases, right? So this is actually, these habenular nuclei are involved with the emotional and visceral responses to odor. And it kind of helps explain why odors elicit such strong emotional and visceral responses. You guys ever smell something that just like is so foul, so putrid that your whole body feels ill from that? Yeah, I mean, and you might wonder, like, these things are totally disconnected. Like, just to smell a chemical, how's it going to make your internal organs, change? Well, the habenular nuclei of your epithalamus. That's pretty amazing. Also the emotional responses too. So if you did smell, dog feces, that could lead to visceral and emotional responses. So now in terms of the thalamus, what we find here, you guys, are paired oval masses of gray matter. So what was gray matter again? No. Gray matter. No, not myelinated axons. That's white. Cell bodies, yeah. Now I'll explain why it's gray, actually, because maybe you guys didn't pick that up. Gray matter is gray because cell bodies contain more protein. And if you have large collections of cell bodies, you have a lot of protein locally, which looks more gray. Okay. So if the thalamus contains a lot of gray matter, then we have a lot of neuron cell bodies here, right? In fact, what do we call gray matter that's deep in the brain? Not in the cortex, but deep in the brain. A collection of cell bodies there. Not a nerve, because that's axons. So a collection of cell bodies deep within the brain. Oh wait, let me get some water while you guys find it. So what's a collection of neuron cell bodies deep within the brain? And if you're watching YouTube right now, you're probably screaming at the screen.
Motor
Not motor neurons, no.
cerebral nuclei.
Nuclei, nice. Very good, thank you. Nice. So the nuclei are a collection of neuron cell bodies deep within the brain. So our thalamus then has our thalamic, guess what? Nuclei. Who would have thought? So the nuclei then are a collection of neuron cell bodies here. And one of the main functions of your thalamus, you guys, is to act as a sensory relay center of your brain. So what the thalamus does is it takes a sending sensory information from your body. When it gets to your brain, the thalamus is like the FedEx here, and it sends it to the appropriate destination, right? Because you need that to occur. Like you wouldn't want touch sensation or touch information to go to your occipital lobe, right? Because if it did, then what you're saying then is you can see touch. You need touch information from your skin to go to what part of your brain? You guys remember? Somatosensory cortex. Good. Now it's the thalamus that would send it there. So the thalamus is the relay center, and it helps you determine the appropriate place for sensory information to travel. Okay. Now, pretty much all senses go through the thalamus except for smell. Smell or olfaction bypasses the thalamus and it goes straight to the learning and memory centers of your brain, as well as the habenular nuclei for the visceral responses to odor. Now, it's also the principal and final relay point for sensory information that's getting processed before it goes to the sensory cortices. And so as a gateway, a gatekeeper here, it really determines whether or not sensory information makes it to the brain. It's a very important aspect here then. So when would you want to shut this off? Like when would you want the thalamus to not send sensory information to the brain? Or like the rest of your cortices rather?
Surgery?
Yeah, during surgery, exactly, right? Because do you want someone to feel knives cutting through their flesh? No, absolutely not. So how do you prevent that? Well, you give them drugs that inhibit the thalamus. And by inhibiting the thalamus, then you can't send that sensory information to the parts of your brain that are involved with perception, right? Which is conscious awareness of that stimulus. So what we're saying is that during surgery, their nerves are still transmitting information about pain towards the brain. It's just that once that information gets to the thalamus, it's not being sent to the sensory areas where perception occurs. So they're not being conscious of that information, although the information is there. However, that can slip by sometimes. You guys hear about like in surgery where people still feel pain during surgery. Or there's other types of sensory information that slip by during surgery, right? They might explain how like they were able to hear people talking during the surgery or how they smelled certain smells. So it's kind of fascinating. Yeah. Oh, you had a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you give someone a drug that like puts the thalamus to sleep or whatever, then
They go to sleep.
yeah, but can they still have like reflexes?
Yeah, exactly. They would still have reflexes because reflexes don't involve the cortex. They involve the brainstem and spinal cord, which don't play a role with the thalamus, but they would still have reflexes. That's a great point. So we think of the thalamus, you guys, as like the sensory relay center of the brain, and it also helps to filter out inappropriate information. So you might wonder, like, what does that mean? Well, if you think about it right now, you guys, you are ignoring things that are inappropriate for the moment, right? There's lots of sensory information right now, like the clothes on your body. You don't have to be aware of that feeling of clothes on your body, right? Or the feeling of pressure on your butts as you sit in chairs. You also don't need to be aware of that right now. The thalamus is involved in attentional processing because it helps you to block out unnecessary information and focus on the types of sensory information that are important for that moment. Okay, so it's kind of cool. The thalamus has all these different nuclei here. Don't worry about memorizing the specific nuclei, but just know that the thalamic nuclei are involved with sensory relay. Okay. In fact, all senses go to the thalamus except for what sense? Smell, olfaction. Very good. That one bypasses the thalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is also extremely important for homeostasis or internal balance. Hypo means below, so this is actually below the thalamus, and it's this thin stalk-like structure that also contains an infundibulum, and the infundibulum is what connects to your pituitary gland. Do y'all remember going back to bones where the pituitary gland sits? Actually, maybe you didn't learn that the pituitary gland sits in that region, but it's a little saddle-shaped structure, you might call. What was that?
It was the one.
Sella turcica, or Sella turcica. It means Turkish saddle, right? That's where the pituitary gland sits. But the pituitary gland is not loose. It's actually attached to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus would be just superior to that pituitary gland, and it's attached by a thin stalk called the infundibulum. But the pituitary gland would actually be housed within that little bony cavity, the Sella turcica. Very good. So what we find here, you guys, this is the hypothalamus. Remember the beak of that bird. You can see in the hypothalamus there are a lot of nuclei. Remember, a nucleus is a collection of neuron cell bodies within here. Okay? And all of these have a variety of different functions. So we have one called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This one's involved in also regulating sleep-wake cycle. Okay? We have one called the ventromedial nucleus, which is involved in your hunger and satiety ability, right? Like if you feel hungry, that's the ventromedial hypothalamus. So these are also involved with things like body temperature regulation, salt and water retention, and it also controls the release of most hormones by your pituitary gland because it's attached. In fact, the pituitary gland is like the master control gland of your body. So it makes sense why the hypothalamus is so important, because the hypothalamus is what controls the pituitary gland, which is like the master control gland of your body. So it's the master of the master. Now, in terms of other functions, you guys remember it's involved with controlling your endocrine system or hormones, hence the pituitary gland. It helps to regulate body temperature, emotional responses like emotional behaviors, things like food intake and water intake. So your sensation of thirst is also controlled by the hypothalamus. So if you're feeling thirsty, that could be a hypothalamic sensation. It also is involved with regulating sleep-wake rhythms, cycles, on top of the epithalamus. And we call it the master control center of your autonomic nervous system. Do you guys remember what autonomic nerves controlled from the last chapter? Yeah, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Very good. So the autonomic nervous system, we got a whole chapter on this coming up. The hypothalamus is the master control center of that division of your nervous system. So we're saying here that your hypothalamus controls cardiac muscle, smooth muscle throughout your body, and a lot of glandular secretion. So it's extremely important for helping to regulate, basically homeostasis or internal balance. Now, the brainstem also has three parts. So it's got a midbrain, a pons, and a medulla oblongata. But the brainstem is like it sounds, guys. It's like the stem of the brain, right? So it's the stalk of the brain that kind of protrudes downward. This does not have like conscious brain centers. It really has a lot of reflex centers that help maintain, homeostasis. It also serves as a passageway for descending and ascending information, right? So if information is ascending towards your brain, What type of information do you think that is? Like going up towards the brain?
Afferent.
Afferent, aka sensory. Nice. And then how about if it's information that's descending down the brainstem? Efferent?
Motor.
Motor. Very good. Whether that's somatic or visceral motor, we don't know. But that still passes through the brainstem in some regard. So it serves as an important passageway. If this gets damaged, it's not survivable, right? You can't live without a brainstem. That's what we saw with Mike the Headless Chicken, right? The reason why Mike the Headless Chicken was able to survive after getting its head chopped off is it still had a brainstem there. Even though the rest of its brain was chopped away, its brainstem was still intact. So although it couldn't think and feel, it could still respond in a reflexive way. What do I mean by that? Well, it can control things like respiratory rhythm, heart rate, blood pressure, right? These are all just reflexes that your brainstem can use. So it's got three major parts, you guys. We've got the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So this is what the brainstem looks like. And you can see that it's associated with your diencephalon up here because here's your thalamus. But associated with this, here's our midbrain. So all of this is the midbrain. And it makes sense that you have these projections into the thalamus because, you know, thalamus is the sensory relay center. And if the brainstem also relays sensory information, you can see here that there's a lot of, like, you know, tracts that go up through the thalamus via the brainstem. Now, the midbrain here contains different reflex centers, which we'll talk about. Also contains areas for movement. The pons here in the middle is a sort of central projection. This one actually contains respiratory centers. And the medulla oblongata has a lot of different reflex functions as well that we'll get to. So looking back here is a posterior view of our brainstem. Here's the thalamus, which is part of the diencephalon. We can see our midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Do you guys see this space here? What ventricle do you guys think this is, if it's in the brainstem? The fourth. Nice. This is the fourth ventricle in the pons. And actually, that's the last large ventricular space before CSF leaks out through the apertures. And you can see there's a lot of cranial nerves coming off the brainstem. In fact, most of your cranial nerves originate from your brainstem. So in terms of functions of the midbrain, it's the superior-most part of the brainstem. I know midbrain makes it seem like it's in the middle of the brain. It's technically not. We just call it the midbrain. But think of this as being the superior-most part of the brainstem. It contains your cerebral aqueduct, which is what connects the third and fourth ventricles together, as well as the periaqueductal gray. This is some gray matter that surrounds that cerebral aqueduct, and this is involved with pain modulation and species-specific behaviors, right? Like behaviors that are specific to certain species on Earth, especially mammals, which have periaqueductal gray. These kind of behaviors are located or sort of localized to these PGM, so the periaqueductal gray matter. Now, other nuclei of different cranial nerves also is here, like cranial nerve number 3 and 4. We also have the cerebral peduncles, and these cerebral peduncles are large tracts of axons that help to transmit motor and sensory information, up and down your brain. Now, we also have the superior cerebellar peduncles, which connect to your cerebellum, so it's involved with some motor processing in that regard. Now, the midbrain has your tegmentum. The tegmentum is found near the substantia nigra, which means black substance, and it's responsible for relaying information between your cerebrum and cerebellum. So when you think of your tegmentum, think of this as being a relay center for movement. Since your cerebrum is involved with planning movement, and your cerebellum is involved with helping to store muscle memory, it's a communication between those two. The tegmentum is involved there. So that's an important function there. Now, substantia nigra houses clusters of neurons that produce a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Because this dopamine neurotransmitter has a darker appearance, that region of gray matter looks darker. So that's what we call black substance or substantia nigra. Now, it actually controls movement and emotional responses, but we see that degeneration of the substantia nigra occurs with Parkinson's disease. So when individuals have Parkinson's disease, they actually start to lose these dopaminergic neurons in their substantia nigra. And if you look at the biopsy of someone with Parkinson's, instead of looking dark, it's almost just like white matter there, because you get a death of those neurons and a loss of dopamine. So you guys will learn more about that in pathophysiology. Now, the midbrain also contains your superior and inferior colliculi, which are reflex centers for visual and auditory information. So you might wonder, what's a visual reflex? Well, that would be where you can just respond to something reflexively without ever actually being conscious of that. Can you guys think of an example of like when you might have a reflex due to vision, but before you can even think about it? What's that?
The eyes dilating?
That's different actually, but that's a great point.
Flies on your face.
Yeah, flinching, right? Like if something's flying at your face and you flinch, you might flinch before you even realize that you see something flying at your face, right? That's actually the superior colliculus that's involved with that. And that does not require any kind of consciousness. It's totally subconscious and it's a reflex, right? And then the inferior colliculi are involved with auditory reflex, which is responding to auditory information in a reflexive manner, right? So this is where you would essentially, like, let's say, flinch due to a sound. Like maybe you hear something flying at you, and then you like flinch or duck in response to that sound, but this is before you actually are conscious of that sound, right? Because this is totally a reflex. Yeah.
Could that be like PTSD? You hear a bomb or a gunshot, and then automatically it's like,
Yeah, I mean, there's ways you can make reflexes more sensitive, and they could be sensitized from prior experience, right? So, like, if you, went through a traumatic experience where there's a lot of like bombs and gunfire, those kinds of loud noises may have sensitized the inferior colliculi, so that other loud noises also make you have stronger and more easy to trigger reflexes, and that could be associated with psychological disorders like PTSD. So actually, there's an interesting phenomenon, you guys, I want to mention to y'all. There's actually a type of reflex where we call it blind sight. And it's essentially where someone is consciously blind, but their eyes still function. But you don't see with your eyes. You only pick up information with your eyes. You see consciously with your occipital lobe. Okay? So blind sight is where you have occipital lobe damage, but your reflex centers are still intact, and your eyes are still intact. So you can still pick up visual information. You can still respond to visual information in a reflexive way, but you're not conscious of anything that's out there in front of you. So blind sight would be like if you're consciously blind, you can't see a thing, but a ball is flying at your face and you're able to duck it. But you're ducking it not because you actually saw it. You're ducking it in a reflexive way because you have the superior colliculus intact. In fact, you never saw that thing coming. In fact, they couldn't tell you there was a ball. They just would feel their body move in response to that thing coming at their face, even though they never saw the ball coming or the fact that there was a ball itself, unless it hit them. Yeah?
So the same thing where, like, you showed us that video last quarter where the guy, like, flips just to stop flies. What's going on?
I mean, I'm sure he relies on a lot of reflexes. That's a different process, but that's a good question. Now, this is showing the midbrain here, you guys. Again, you got the substantia nigra. What was the substantia nigra involved with? It's darker because of dopamine, and that's involved with movement. Very good. Yep. So, an emotional response is good. So what we find then is that if you get damage to substantia nigra, then you get movement disorders, right? So you guys ever seen Parkinson's before? This is where essentially they have a very stiff and rigid movements, but they have kind of a shuffling gait rather than like nice, fluid, clean movements because they have difficulty moving due to damage of this brain region. We also find our tectum. Remember, this is involved with relaying information from your cerebrum to your cerebellum. And we also have our periaqueductal gray, which surrounds the cerebral aqueduct. That's involved with pain modulation and species-specific behaviors. So you might wonder, what's a species-specific behavior? Well, like beavers building a dam, right? You don't have to show a beaver how to build a dam. They don't learn that from their parents or other beavers. If you had a beaver, like in a zoo, by itself, it would still build a dam. Even if it was born in that zoo, never had any other interaction with any beavers, it would still know, somehow, to make a dam, right? Well, because that's ingrained in its biology. And so what we find is that this periaqueductal gray is associated with those kinds of behaviors, species-specific behaviors. It's kind of fascinating. Do you guys think of any species-specific behaviors for humans? No? Huh? I mean, breeding is one of those things. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a characteristic of all living organisms. We all need to reproduce, right? Not all, but I mean, you know what I mean. Like, there's There's a strive for the species to reproduce, otherwise the species becomes extinct. So that's an interesting one. Yeah, maybe technology. I think about that. Like, what differentiates humans from other animals? Well, I feel like it's our strive to make, right? To make things and to develop technologies that improve our lives. And it's pretty awesome. So I think that's pretty cool. You had a question?
No, I can't.
Okay. So the pons here, you guys, is this bulging anterior part of the brainstem, and this actually has respiratory centers for your body. It also has the nuclei for a lot of different cranial nerves, but the superior olivary complex is actually helping you to localize sound. So when you think of sound localization, you're using your pons and the superior olivary complex to localize that sound. You might wonder, what's sound localization? Well, you guys know where the sound is coming from in this room, because if I'm standing here and I'm talking, the sound is projecting out towards you guys at a certain angle, right? Now, depending on my position, that sound might get to one ear faster than another. Like if I'm standing over here, right? Which ear do you guys think the sound is reaching first?
Left.
Yeah, your left ears are getting that sound first. And your eyes can be closed, and you'd still know that the sound's coming from your left. Because what the superior olivary complex does is it compares information from the right and left ears. It analyzes the delay between those two, and it helps you localize the direction of noise based on that delay, right? So if information is coming to the left ear faster than the right, then you know your sound is coming from the left. This is pretty awesome, and you're actually pretty precise, guys. If you guys close your eyes and I walked around the room and I started snapping my fingers, you could point exactly where I was with pretty reasonable accuracy. That's a Pons function through the superior olivary complex. It's pretty phenomenal. Yeah, it is like a superpower, right? But it's something that we all can do. So the pons is this middle bulge here on the brainstem, and it contains respiratory centers as well as the nuclei for different cranial nerves, and the superior olivary complex, which is involved with sound localization. Now, what about this medulla oblongata, right? Y'all remember that from that horrible movie Waterboy? The reason why I say it's horrible is I used to love it when I was a kid, but I saw it again recently as an adult, and it was the worst movie I've probably seen. And I would never watch it again. I know, right? I challenge you to watch it in like 10 years and be like, do you still like it? I thought it was just stupid. It wasn't even funny. And I'm not like dissing you. I don't like that movie. You gotta respect our differences. So, you're the one taking it personally. So, the medulla oblongata, from that horrible movie Waterboy, it's the most inferior part of your brainstem. It contains the pyramids, which have projection of motor tracts. It also has a lot of reflex centers, which are involved with things like regulating your blood pressure, your heart rate, even respiratory rate. That your medulla oblongata can control this. Now, the cardiac center of your medulla oblongata regulates heart rate and strength of heart muscle contraction. The vasomotor center controls the diameter of your blood vessels, which regulates blood pressure. And then the medullary respiratory center regulates respiratory rate or rhythm. And you can see here now why you need this to survive, right? If you damage your medulla oblongata, then what you're saying here is you can no longer control your blood pressure very well. You won't be able to breathe on your own very well, and nor can you control your heart rate very well either. So this is the significance of the medulla oblongata in that regard in terms of keeping you alive. Now, we said that Mike the Headless Chicken still had a brainstem intact, right? So you might wonder, okay, well, what could Mike do if it still had a brainstem? Well, in the midbrain, we can still have auditory and visual reflex. However, Mike's head was cut off, so it's not getting any kind of auditory or visual information. Okay. In the midbrain, we also have movement centers, so it can still move a little bit. In the pons, we have the superior olivary complex, which is involved with sound localization, but Mike's head was chopped off, so it's not getting any sound information anymore either. Okay. So really what Mike was relying on at this point, guys, is the medulla. So what could Mike do? Well, Mike could still regulate its little birdie blood pressure. Mike could still control its little birdie heart and control its little birdie respiratory rhythms, okay? And it breathes that little hole that's left on its neck. It can also undergo different reflexes. So let's check this out. Oh, dang it. I'm just kidding. I thought I had a slide for reflex. Oh, here it is. Never mind. So other reflexes that the medulla oblongata does are things like coughing, hiccuping, swallowing, sneezing, vomiting. So those are reflexes that are mediated through the medulla oblongata. Is this a conscious brain center though? Like can you be perceptually aware here? No, exactly. So basically what we're saying here is that Mike lost the rest of its cerebrum, and it could keep its body alive using a brainstem, but couldn't actually, think or feel for that matter. So it's just kind of keeping that body alive. Same goes for humans, you guys. If someone is brain dead, but maybe their medulla oblongata still is functioning, effectively the person is gone. What's left is just some brain matter that can keep their tissues alive. But the person, like the personality, the conscious, living, loving, wanting person is since gone. Yeah?
So when you get like severe alcohol poisoning, you just hear that.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're dying from like alcohol overdose, then what we're saying then, or even alcohol poisoning, we're saying that there's so much alcohol in your system that it's depressed, because it's a depressant, it's depressed these functions, where you might not be able to breathe anymore. You might not be able to regulate your blood pressure well anymore. And this is how people die of alcohol intoxication. Yeah, it's kind of interesting how, there's thousands of alcohol deaths every year, but it's still legal, right? With respect to other drugs, which I won't get into. Look at this medulla oblongata, you guys. We can see it's the inferior-most part of the brainstem, and it's involved with a lot of reflexes. So what are some of the important functions it controls? Blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate.
Vomiting, coughing.
Nice. Vomiting, coughing, hiccuping, sneezing, swallowing. So if someone can do those things, that doesn't mean that they're thinking or, aware. Someone can still sneeze even if they're brain dead, right? At least it's with respect to the cerebrum, as long as their medulla oblongata is still intact. So it's fascinating.